San Diego, California, December 8, 1846. In the middle of the night, in the desert 30 miles east of the city, Kit Carson, legendary American mountain man, lies face down in the dirt, not moving a muscle and doing his best to slow his breathing. Mere yards away, a Mexican soldier on sentry duty sits atop his fine Californio horse, coolly smoking a cigaretto and enjoying a brief moment of relaxation and solitude in the middle of the Southern California desert. Carson knows that should this soldier discover his location, he and his two comrades will assuredly be taken prisoner and likely executed. Still, as Carson grits his teeth, the soldier remains blissfully unaware of any enemy presence, merely enjoying his cigarette, filling the air around himself with the fragrant smell of burning tobacco, and peacefully observing the night sky above him. The unnerving scene drags on for several minutes, with the silence of the desert night making the already tense air of the situation all but unbearable. Suddenly, Carson grows even more concerned. With one ear pressed tightly to the ground, he hears a faint, thundering rhythm. He wonders if these are the hoofbeats of more Californio soldiers coming to join their comrade. Then, Carson feels a hand nudging one of his boots. As Carson strains his eyes down and behind himself, he sees the cause of the noise. It is, in fact, the racing heartbeat of one of his companions, the 24-year-old naval lieutenant Edward Beale. Lieutenant Beale, his nerves pushed to the literal breaking point, whispers to Carson, "We're gone. Let's jump up and fight it out." "Been in worse places before," Carson assures him, then turns back to flatten himself against the desert floor. Finally, the Californio finishes his indulgent smoke and returns to his main camp, much to the relief of Carson and his comrades. Carson is part of a three-man group of volunteers, comprised of himself, Lieutenant Beale, and a Diegueño native guide named Chomokta. They are on a mission to reach the American-held port of San Diego in order to send reinforcements back to their stranded comrades roughly 30 miles east of San Diego. The day before, the Americans, a combined force of U.S. Army soldiers, Navy sailors, Marines, and civilian volunteers, had fought a vicious battle against the local Californio forces. The battle, known to history as the Battle of San Pasqual, had been fought in the interest of the ongoing Mexican-American War, in which Mexico seeks to retain control of its lands, which comprise most of the present-day American Southwest and Pacific Northwest. When the damp weather had rendered many of their firearms inoperable, the Americans had suffered dearly at the end of the Californio's rudimentary but deathly effective steel-tipped lances. After the Americans were able to bring forth and fire their brass field cannons, the Californio forces had been finally forced to disperse, but not before killing 18 Americans and inflicting countless more deep, grievous wounds in the bodies of the surviving men. Under the command of General Stephen F. Kearny, himself gravely injured after suffering a lance wound to his lower back, the Americans had retreated to the top of a small rock-strewn hill. Here, they found themselves surrounded by roaming Californio forces, who covered virtually all of the territory between themselves and their nearest comrades in the port of San Diego, thus cutting off any hope of escape or relief. The U.S. Army soldiers amongst this group of men under General Kearny had not only survived the battle, they have completed the longest cross-country trek in U.S. military history up to that point, traversing half the length of the continent after marching out of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and traveling through Santa Fe. They had then trekked across the barren deserts of the Southwest before finally meeting the Mexican Army in battle here in the desert east of San Diego. Their counterparts in the U.S. Marines and Navy sailors, riding under the command of U.S. Marine Captain Archibald Gillespie, had ridden out to reinforce Kearny's men. Now, these men, many of whom are unable to walk, much less make the 30-mile trek through enemy territory, had to rely on their able-bodied comrades to volunteer to make this perilous journey in order to send back reinforcements and ultimately save their lives. Among these able-bodied men, none was a more obvious choice for this seemingly impossible task than Kit Carson. Among the few participants in the battle on the American side not to hold an official position in the military, Carson has nonetheless already cemented his legacy as an inveterate mountain man, guide, and experienced gunfighter. After deterring a cross-country mission with secret correspondence for President James K. Polk in order to assist Kearny as a civilian guide, Carson had proven an invaluable asset to both the general and his men. Along with Carson, the two other exceedingly brave men, Lieutenant Beale and Chomokta, had volunteered to venture forth into the expanses of the hilly, chaparral-covered desert in order to at least attempt to save their comrades. They had waited until nightfall before making their initial scramble down the sandy cliffs of the rocky hill, being cautious to avoid the Californio sentries that lined the hillsides all around them. By the time the party had reached the bottom of the hill, it had become clear that their metal canteens would be too noisy to carry with them. They had thus each taken one last, long drink and left their only water supplies tucked into the rocks of a small arroyo. Carson and Lieutenant Beale had also discovered that, unfortunately, their hard-soled boots would cause too much commotion while they traversed the rocky ground before them. While their native comrade Chomokta continued on relatively unencumbered and silent in his leather moccasins, the pair of Americans had been forced to remove their boots, tuck them into their belts, and proceed forward barefoot. Now, as the Mexican soldier rides back towards his camp, Carson and Beale are suddenly horrified to realize that, somewhere in their crawling on the desert floor, their boots have come loose from their belts. Considering their already precarious position, retracing their steps to look for the boots is out of the question, and thus both men will have to complete the 30-mile trek through the thorny desert barefoot. With no other option, the three men carry on, silently trudging their way through the sparse landscape, sticking as best they can to the cover of dry riverbeds and small ravines. Despite their lack of footwear, they travel as quickly as possible, knowing that the rising sun will bring with it a host of new problems. Meanwhile, back at the American camp atop the isolated hill, the men find themselves in increasingly dire straits. Food supplies have already begun to wane, as has their supply of potable water. Many of the injured men are starting to see signs of infection, as the deep and incongruous nature of the damage inflicted by the long steel lance tips makes them exceedingly difficult to close and keep clean. Since the day of the battle, Sergeant John S. Griffin has worked feverishly to tend to the Americans' wounds, but it seems to the doctor that a never-ending stream of the bloodied, injured men pour through the canvas-flap doors of his operating tent. General Kearny himself, suffering from the lance wounds that had torn into his lower back and hip, had passed out on the dirt floor of the tent after insisting that more seriously wounded men be tended to ahead of himself. Simply in order to move the injured men from the site of the battlefield to the hilltop, Kearny's men had constructed makeshift travois. These two long poles, which connect at a point, after which a bed is built between the poles and attached to a horse, had for centuries provided the tribes of the Great Plains with an effective, efficient means of transporting goods and people. However, on the rock-strewn, hilly grounds of the Southern California desert, they provided a nightmarishly jarring, bone-rattling ride for their unfortunate, incapacitated passengers. Now, the few able-bodied men left have taken to killing and cooking their mules, beginning with the weakest and least useful animals, stewing the meat into a thin, greasy soup that the men do their best to keep down, with some being unable to do so. General Stephen Kearny, suffering greatly from loss of blood, has relinquished command to Captain Henry Smith Turner. The general, who had once led his forces out of Kansas to much nationalistic fervor, pomp, and circumstance, now lies prostrate, pale, and helpless inside of his tent. When they had first arrived atop the hill, Turner had ordered some of his able-bodied men to engage and drive off the California Lancer forces that stalked their movements and harassed them incessantly. This his men had managed to do, with their carbines proving far more effective now that the conditions had warmed and their powder had dried. But now, as the Americans languish on the hilltop, Mexican Commander Don Andres Pico's men and other contingents of Mexican soldiers and California volunteers begin to flood into the surrounding areas, looking to cut off any escape for their enemy and to mount a final charge to decimate their forces once and for all. Now effectively trapped and with their ammunition and food supplies dwindling further and further, Captain Turner is faced with the prospect of either turning out their remaining starving mules and horses to graze, in which case they would almost certainly be stolen by the surrounding Mexican forces, or to slaughter the animals immediately, rendering he and his men truly devoid of any means of transportation, save for walking to San Diego. The American soldiers know that, with every Mexican soldier who arrives to surround their position, the likelihood of Carson, Beale, and Chomokta reaching San Diego has become less and less. Don Andres Pico himself has, in fact, surmised that it will likely be Kit Carson, if anyone among the Americans, who will make a bid to escape to San Diego and secure reinforcements. Though the two men do not know each other personally, Pico is familiar with Carson's prior exploits throughout the whole of Alta California. He knows that Kit Carson is a dangerous man, and that in order to secure a victory for the Mexican forces, he will have to be neutralized. Carson is known amongst the Mexican forces as El Lobo, or the Wolf, and Don Andres Pico has explicitly warned his forces to remain vigilant, or se escapada el Lobo. The Wolf will escape. Now, as the hours pass on the hilltop, it seems more and more probable to the stranded men that their comrades' bid to reach American lines in San Diego has failed, resulting in either their capture, killing, or both. But, miles away, past the edge of the western horizon, Kit Carson, Lieutenant Beale, and Chomokta press on through the night, accumulating untold damage to their feet as they plod their way through the unforgiving landscape. By dawn the next morning, they are clear of the initial rings of Mexican security forces that surround their stranded comrades. By that afternoon, they are within 12 miles of the city of San Diego. But now, they face the challenge of navigating undetected through the several rings of security forces that surround the city and its harbor. Seeing that seemingly every known path to the city's limits are blocked by the Mexican sentries, the three men huddle in a shaded arroyo and confer upon their next move. Carson advises that they split up, a chilling proposition to all those involved, but a prudent one, as Carson wagers that capturing 3 individuals would be a tougher job for the Mexican army than simply capturing one group. And so, all 3 determine their separate paths, with Chomokta and Lieutenant Beale taking the 2 shorter routes, and Carson volunteering for the longer, more dangerous route. With no time for ceremony or sentimentalities, the 3 men part ways, heading west to the California coast, with each knowing that they will either succeed in their endeavor or, likely, die, and that the lives of their comrades stranded on the hilltop depend on them. All through the afternoon, into the night, the 3 men skulk through enemy territory, each on an individual journey of turmoil, peril, and endurance that will test them to their absolute limits. It will be past midnight when Chomokta and Beale reach the American lines, arriving around the same time, with each man so fatigued that they have to be taken to the USS Congress, stationed in the San Diego harbor, where they will linger near death for several days. Carson staggers into camp around 3 a.m., his more circuitous route having delayed him even longer than his comrades. In a near-delirious state of exhaustion, Carson confirms the location of Kearny and Gillespie's forces on the hilltop with Commodore John F. Stockton. Stockton informs him that reinforcements have been dispatched, and Carson finally partakes in the first food, water, and sleep he has seen in nearly 36 hours. Meanwhile, the men stranded on the hilltop, still with no clue as to the whereabouts of their relief party, continue with their struggle to care for their wounded comrades, with their infected wounds presenting increasingly more frightening spectacles with seemingly every examination, as well as to sustain themselves amid their shortage of food and water. The last of the starving mules are finally killed, their ailing and withered bodies offered up as a last-ditch form of sustenance to their starving masters. Though it is an unfortunate necessity, one that provides much-needed nourishment to the men, the gruesome, heart-wrenching spectacle of this slaughter only serves to further weaken morale as well as to cement the notion that they are truly without escape in the middle of the barren Southern California desert. In order to quench their thirst, the men dig into the sand until reaching a layer that has retained some level of moisture from the recent rainfall. The soil is heaped into squares of cloth, then any available liquid, however muddy and disagreeable, is wrung out. For 2 long days and nights, this harrowing ordeal continues. Finally, though, General Kearny is able to regain enough strength to return to command. His field sergeant, Dr. Griffin, informs him that, likewise, most of the injured men have regained enough strength to sit horseback. With their supplies nearly gone, and any hope of rescue seeming to be fleeting, Kearny orders the men to ready themselves for a forced march to San Diego at first light. Come what may, they will not sit on this hilltop to fall prey to their adversaries. At dawn, they will make a run for their lives to the coast. However, that night, as the tired and battle-sore men sleep fitfully, an American sentry on guard is sent into a near panic by the sound of an approaching force of cavalry. He calls out into the darkness, "Halt! Who goes there?" The call goes unanswered, with the thundering hoofbeats only getting closer and closer to the sentry's position. With his weapon now shouldered, the sentry calls out again, "Who goes there?" This time, however, the reply nearly brings the weary man to tears of joy as Captain William H. Emery, commander of the 200-man relief forces dispatched from San Diego, calls out, "Hold fire! We're Americans." The American camp now resounds with the cheers of men who, only hours before, had seen their hopes of survival as all but lost. In the midst of their celebrations, a single shot rings out from a Mexican sniper hidden in the hills, striking harmlessly into the ground. It would be the last shot of the entire engagement, as the Americans would find all of the Mexican forces gone in the morning, having returned under nightfall to Los Angeles to fortify that city against the newly realized American threat. The combined American forces will make their march to San Diego without so much as seeing another opposing soldier. They arrive on December 12th on a chilly, rainy day, much to the relief of Carson, Stockton, and the rest of their countrymen. Many among the American soldiers are overcome with emotion upon seeing the Pacific Ocean for the first time, as the endless stretch of water before them represents the culmination of their unprecedentedly long and arduous transcontinental journey. Though the war is not over, it feels for many of the young sailors, soldiers, and Marines that the worst of the war, for them, has come and gone. The spot where they had made their desperate stand and survived on the flesh of their mules will stand as a landmark of San Diego history, known forevermore as Mule Hill. What has only begun, though, is the national renown and celebrity of Christopher Houston Carson. His leadership during, before, and after the battle, and his willingness to lay down his life in order to aid in the rescue effort, make him a favorite topic of letters written home from American soldiers, sailors, and Marines now stationed in San Diego. One soldier pens a particularly effusive letter home to his parents in Connecticut, proclaiming that, "Never has there been a man like Kit Carson. All that has been said about him, and more, is true. He is as fearless as the lion, as stealthy as the panther, as strong as the oxen. I believe that Carson would attack a fort filled with Mexicans, single-handed, and drive them off." Carson, for his part, barely even acknowledges his accomplishments in his memoirs, writing laconically that, "Finally got through, but had the misfortune of having lost our shoes. Had to travel over a country covered with prickly pear and rocks, barefoot. Got to San Diego the next night." In the years to come, Carson will become a national media star, the subject of dime novels and newspaper articles that will cause his name to be as well known in many eastern cities as the president. The young naval lieutenant Edward Beale is said to have convalesced for an entire year before returning to active duty with the Navy, but he too will go on to national acclaim and a legendary career spanning decades of service in the Old West. Already known as a hero of the Battle of San Pasqual, he would rise to even greater fame in 1848 as the man to bring the first samples of gold from the streams of Northern California to the cities of the East. This tangible proof of the newly won state's gilded bounty would be a key driving factor in the 1849 California gold rush, an event that would reshape the nation forever. He would go on to a career as a successful diplomat, serving as superintendent of the Office of Indian Affairs before retiring to life as a rancher. He would remain friends with Carson, who remarked upon seeing his friend aboard the USS Congress that he, quote, did not think that he could live, as well as maintain friendships with Buffalo Bill Cody, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Ulysses S. Grant, among others. He would pass away in 1893 at his home in Chester, Pennsylvania. Chomokta, the Diegueño native guide, by some accounts took a similarly long time to recover, and, by some accounts, perished as a result of his treacherous journey. His tribe, known amongst themselves as the Kumeyae, already brought to the breaking point under the yoke of decades of California rule, would continue to struggle under the United States government for much of the 19th century. They would play pivotal roles in the San Diego Tax Rebellion of 1851, also known as Garra's Revolt, as well as the Yuma War and even the Mexican Revolution. Today, Chomokta's band, the San Pasqual Band of Diego Mission Indians of California, is a federally recognized tribe, with many of their tribal members residing on the San Pasqual Reservation. As for Kit Carson, he will take over a week of recovering in San Diego before regaining the ability to walk normally, his feet so battered by the desert floor that he can scarcely take but a few steps without excruciating pain for days. But recover he will. Carson will soon be on the trail again, heading west to reunite with his family in Taos, New Mexico. Already an American icon and an inveterate frontiersman, Carson will go on to continue his exploits for decades to come. His travels will take him from San Diego, back through the treacherous deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, then to St. Louis, before finally settling in Taos for a few years before continuing his adventures. Though the Mexican-American War in California will continue with a series of minor skirmishes, the worst of the action in California has largely passed. The Battle of San Pasqual will go down as the bloodiest, most consequential battle of the Mexican-American War to be fought on California soil. The Mexican-American War itself will drag on until 1848, finally coming to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But, though the men of Kearny's army can now take their rest, the battles that are taking place further south into Mexico, and the battles that will continue to unfold for the coming year, will go down as some of the most vicious, bloodthirsty combat ever waged in the 19th century. But the stories of the many brutal battles of the unforgiving and highly controversial Mexican-American War, as well as the many tales from the life of Kit Carson, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the blue Join button below. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.